All right, everybody, welcome to today's author chat episode. We're chatting with Tom Bennett. Tom, for those of you who don't know him, you should. Tom's the founder of Research Ed, which is a grassroots organization that raises research literacy in education and also campaigns for better evidence awareness worldwide. In 2015, Tom actually became the UK government's school behavior czar, advising on behavior policy, as well as chairing the Mental Health in Schools panel. He's written 4 books about teacher training. And in 2015 also was long listed as one of the world's top teachers in the Global Teacher Prize. In the same year, also in 2015, so this was a busy year for Tom, he made the Huffington Post top 10 global bloggers list. And additionally, he is the director of Tom Bennett Training, which works exclusively with the most disadvantaged students in schools in England, helping them to turn around. So today we're going to be talking to Tom about his latest book, which is Running the Room, A Teacher's Guide to Behavior. Tom, welcome to the show.
What an honor it is, Ross. Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, and I see here, that your online resources have been viewed more than 1.2 million times. So we'll get that number up by the dozens today. How about that?
There's one for today at least, yeah.
Right. So let's get right into it. And, something I wanted to start off with. So on a recent episode of the Mind the Gap podcast, which is co-hosted by Tom Sherrington and Emma Turner, Tom mentioned that this is the book, Running the Room, is the book he wishes he had early in his career. And obviously he eventually figured it out regarding behavior management, became a successful teacher, school head, and author and everything else. But I think it speaks to how widespread the issue is, that teachers of all stripes are entering the profession. They have limited, if any, training in behavior management, classroom management, all of these things that are the first thing you encounter when you enter the profession. And my question is, where is the disconnect? If we know that this affects every single teacher, and yet still this is really not part of the, consistently part of the training, why not in pre-service? And what can we do to kind of start to bridge that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's kind of why I wrote the book. Basically, teacher preparation in the UK, if I can just mention that first to begin with, is really weak. It's really thin. And I didn't even realize how thin it was until I was a teacher for like 5 years. And then I realized that it wasn't just me. I really smelt a rat, that it wasn't being taught. And that it was the thing that most teachers were worried about and yet were suffering most from when they got to the classroom. I also realized, I mean, like MC Hammer, I've been around the world and I've seen that this is a problem in lots of different countries. And it seems to be that behavior management is really fallen out of fashion as something that teachers need to be taught. The idea appears to be you'll pick it up as you go along, presumably by osmosis or something, which is just a terrible way of training somebody in anything, let alone something so important. I mean, let's not train heart surgeons like that or airline pilots. And yet teachers alone are expected to pick this kind of stuff up by themselves, which means they reinvent the wheel every generation, which means every generation of teachers, every cohort is as good or as bad as the last one. And we never build upon the previous year's successes. That's crazy. And that's not how societies and civilizations develop. So I think that the reason why it's fallen out of fashion is, I guess, because of kind of the 19th century philosophy of progressivism, this idea that children are naturally good, that they're instinctively curious, that really the teacher just has to kind of get the hell out of the way and kids will want to learn and they'll direct their own learning and so on. I mean, this goes back to people like Rousseau and people like Dewey and so on, and it's junk. There's absolutely no evidence to support this whatsoever. But education, as I've noted many, many times, is often stuck in the 19th century. And it's stubborn refusal to confront the realities of the 20th, let alone the 21st century, appears to be one of the reasons why we're still stuck in this paradigm that, if your lessons are cool, whizzy, and interesting, the kids will behave. What a load of rubbish. And I would laugh at it more if it weren't real children and real teachers that are being crushed by this inanity. And of course, the sad factor is that the kids who suffer the most are the least advantaged children, right, the most peripheral to cultures and communities. So, that's what kind of keeps me awake at night. I'm sorry, that was a $10 answer for a $5 question. I apologize.
No, no, no. I like a $10 answer. And I think
I'll
that,
be more 50, I promise.
that hits on a point that is worth digging into, which is this issue, not because of anything confrontational or any, but there's controversy and a lack of consensus, at least a lack of consensus around behavior management.
Oh, yeah.
And and so you work in schools, and you make it a habit of working in schools with less advantaged students. Often it really does seem that a lot of the lack of agreement here is educators that are working in different types of schools. So maybe schools that are more on the privileged end of the spectrum
Mm,
have a hard time seeing eye to eye with the realities of what educators might do and need to do in the more underprivileged school environments, really in an effort to create equity, right? To say, we're not going to give up on these kids. This is what we have to do, and we really have to lay the foundation. But
yeah.
kind of, what have you seen in that debate? Because I think you touched on it, and there's trends that go in a certain direction, and a lot of them with positive intent and
Mm,
certain positive outcomes. But when it comes to this behavior issue specifically, and just discipline overall, that's an area where I think it is super relevant, when you need to have the experience in the specific school environments where different challenges are occurring, or else it's really hard to have a perspective on what's happening in a different type of school environment.
yeah. Yeah. No, a great question. Listen, everything in education is controversial. Education is a bear pit, because it's as much a moral enterprise as a practical enterprise. And this is why we get these enormous disagreements. And there's lots of very strongly held positions, and some people have got very little evidence to support their view, and some people have got, let's say, more evidence to support their view. Okay, if you get one child and that child is punctual and polite and comes to your classroom on time and is great at handing in homework and says please and thank you and gives you an apple and so on. If students still give apples to teachers, who knows? You might say, what a great student. And you might have another student who's, late and lazy and tardy and rude and all the rest of it. And you might think, oh, what a tough student that is. Here's the ever-living truth. Neither of these students invented themselves. Yeah, both of these kids are the products of their environment. Both of these kids have come from somewhere. I believe in free will and responsibility, but that's something that really kind of starts to pick up steam as kids get older, and particularly when they're younger. Kids don't decide who to be. And the first kid who's great has been taught all these great character skills and habits and aptitudes through fortunate circumstances, by somebody else. It could be a parent, or it could be a previous teaching phase or stage or something like that. And the kid who's not all these great things has been taught to be like that by their circumstances. And neither of these children have decided very much in the matter, which means that if we want to try to support the second child, if we want to help make sure that they're accessing the curriculum education in an equitable way, that we are helping them develop these habits and skills and aptitudes that help people to be successful students and human beings. And it's no good saying, oh, I'm not here to do all that. I'm just a teacher. I'm here to teach, mathematics or something. Tough. We are where we are. And if you want these kids to do well, you got to teach them these character attributes, habits, and skills, which you'll notice brings me back to kind of one of the core things in my book, which is that behavior is a curriculum. We're not just discussing classrooms of children here who make good and bad choices. We're talking about kids who've got good and bad habits, depending on their circumstances. And it's our job to try and rectify and help them with that, which means that we've got to teach behavior like it's a curriculum, which means we've got to acknowledge the fact that it's something to be taught. And we've got to acknowledge the fact that lots of things we're asking them to do in classrooms is really, really unnatural to them. Sitting still, being patient, sharing, waiting your turn, being kind. We're not born knowing all these kind of things. Anyone who's got small children knows that, that they're born knowing very little. And they have to be taught a lot, including how to tie their shoelaces and go to sleep and go to the toilet. And if we accept that, then we accept that the complex skills that we need them to have in schools to flourish as human beings and learners is something that somebody somewhere has to teach them. And it might have to be us if nobody else has done it before. Otherwise, we're condemning them to the circumstances of where they already are, which if they're disadvantaged means that'll just exacerbate the disadvantage. So I think it's crucial to go back to this idea that behavior is something that can really be taught and needs to be taught.
Right.
Oh, and sorry, I beg your pardon. I just have one last
Go
kind of
for it.
afterthought of a thought there, which is that I hear a lot of people say things like, "Oh, no, children just need love, or you
Hmm.
just need to build relationships with children, and they'll behave for you." This is normally people who either A, have never taught in a challenging school, or B, have never taught, or C, have only ever taught in very, very fortunate and advantaged and privileged circumstances. You might be teaching the sons and daughters of Swiss diplomats in a private school somewhere in the Hamptons. And I'm glad that you do. And I'm glad that these children enjoy all these benefits and advantages. But just because those children are preloaded, pre-baked with all these great habits and aptitudes, doesn't mean that they just magically appear. These things weren't accrued, they were engendered, they were inculcated by caring adults who wanted the best for them. Sorry, I'll take a
Right.
breath now.
Right. No, I think, I think you're on to something. And and there's a lot of
Oh, I hope so.
the controversy ultimately almost seems to stem from the connotations that we have around words, or the emotional responses, and and the feeling by some that if you are focused on behavior and discipline, that it means that um, that you're failing to understand students' backgrounds or needs or realities, rather than that you are understanding them and are taking proactive steps to try to
Yeah,
support them. Or on the other hand, there is a measure of uh, autonomy and who's in charge of decision making and behavior that is an important part of the equation, right? Because if we talk about, just use the word discipline, for example. Well,
mm,
okay, if the perception is that I am imposing discipline on you, then sure, that's disempowering you, and it feels like maybe there's something wrong with the approach. But the fact is, um, what does that word mean? What that word means in schools, and there certainly are bad right examples where it doesn't work the way it
mm,
should. But if you think about it in terms of what that word means as far as a lifelong skill and what students need to develop to succeed, you're an author. You have to have discipline to hit your deadlines and get your book written, right?
absolutely.
You needed to
Yeah,
at some point develop that, because ultimately, even if somebody just tried to impose it on you, eventually you're on your own, and you're not going to have it if you don't have it. So when we think about behavior, a question that I would even have, and when we think about the definitions of words, but just the connotations we have, is how do you, in your own words, just define what behavior is in schools, right? What does it mean? And how do we know that we're all talking about the same thing?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned earlier on in our previous discussion that when I was at university, I studied political philosophy. That was it. Philosophy was really my key subject, and one of the things which is so important when you're discussing anything is to define your terms. And I think this is a really big problem in education because we so rarely define our terms. We talk across purposes. So when I talk about behavior management, this immediately evokes in many people some kind of Dickensian image of corporal punishment and so on. And nothing could be further from the truth. Behavior to me just means anything that you do.
Mhm.
I'm going to take a slightly more kind of biologist perspective here. That's what
Right.
behavior is. Behavior is anything that you do. Anything. The way you say hello, the way you sit down, the way you bring your pencils out of your school bag. And what I mean by good behavior is any behavior or habits of behavior which enables you to flourish, which enables you to flourish in your circumstances. So good behavior for a soldier on the battlefield is very different from the good behavior you would expect of a bartender or a funeral director,
Hmm.
or a teacher. So good behavior is very contextual. Okay, so there's that for a start, and the good behavior for a student is very different from good behavior from an athlete and whatnot. And as you said, discipline is another great word. And discipline, of course, I mean, just simply means the faithfulness and the rigidity of which you can execute something you've intended to do. So therefore, a top athlete has to have loads of discipline, self-discipline. What discipline doesn't mean is lots and lots of punishments. Discipline
Right.
is a fantastic thing for people to have. It's something we should embrace. It's something we should be trying to inculcate in children. Which brings us to another issue, and it's something which comes up time and time again about sanctions and penalties and all these kind of things. What I think fascinating about people who talk about school behaviour is that they talk in a way which is completely dislocated from the way we talk about the rest of society and the way that people actually are. Now, if you want to make sure that people are behaving in a certain way, if you want to help them to behave independently by themselves, you can, for instance, let's take driving, for example. Let's say you want everyone to drive on the freeway at the right speed. One of the things you do is you teach them how to drive a car. The second thing you do is you teach them what the rules of the road are, or the highway code, as we would call it. And the third thing is you try to persuade them that these rules are in their benefit and everyone else's benefit, and they should do it. And I think a lot of people would probably behave well, would drive well based on that, because they know it's the right thing to do. We might call that intrinsic motivation. But if that's all we ever had, we would still have people breaking the law. You'd still have people speeding and tailgating and all kinds of things. Why? Because they're late, because they're busy, because they're distracted, because they're mean, for a million different reasons. So you also have to have deterrence, which means penalties and sanctions. So just in that little illustration I've given you there, any society, any community that wants to try to build a set of positive and healthy behaviors that helps everyone flourish in a flourishing community needs a magazine of approaches in order to change behavior. And we saw this with, for instance, COVID. If you want to get people to wear masks or stay in or socially distance, first of all, what you have to do is you have to teach them what they should be doing. You have to teach them the benefits of what they're doing, really sell it. You have to make it as easy as possible for them to do it. So, for instance, make masks easy to get and so on. And then finally, at the end of that, the tail end of that big, long process of behavior modification, you then maybe have penalties and, reprimands and sanctions for, extremely persistent disobeyment of these rules. So there's a magazine approach to behavior modification. You try to get as many people as possible with as many strategies as possible. And I think so the idea that discipline or that good behavior in school simply means lots of punishments is crazy, because you can't punish somebody into being a good person. You can't punish any community into being good people. That I can imagine if you were a prisoner in a in a yard, in a jail, you potentially could be made to behave. If somebody had a gun trained on you constantly, I guess you could get good behavior that way, but it wouldn't be what you would call making somebody into a good person, nor would they be expected to behave if the gun wasn't trained on them. We can't have this kind of panopticon model of behavior management. That's what happens if you only have one strategy for behavior management. And we do see that sadly in some schools where they think that, everything's got to be a punishment, everything's got to be a sanction. But what we need is a lot more what I call teaching behavior, not telling behavior, which is the main thrust of my book, that we need to teach behavior. And if you use that, which I call the proactive side of the behavior management mechanism, because you're getting in front of the poor behavior before it occurs, and you're teaching kids how to do the things you want them to do, which is only fair, right? Then what you'll do is you'll massively reduce the number of times you have to issue things like penalties and rewards and extrinsic motivators and so on, because the kids will understand far, far more clearly what it is they should be doing. But you got to have them all working in sync. You can't have just one of these strategies. You have to have all these things working together. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart. You go back to the motorway. You take away the penalties, some people will speed, and it only takes a few people to make the freeway a crazy place. But if you take away the proactive teaching, then what you've got is a lot of people who drive really badly and get into trouble a lot because they keep bumping into each other. Neither of these approaches is sane. Neither of them is safe. And I think it's amazing that because we don't teach behavior management training particularly well or particularly clearly to teachers, it also means that lots of principals and school leaders also have got even worse skills when it comes to managing behavior management systems in schools. And this is why we're in the mess we're in. This is why behavior in schools is so bad, because lots of people know what they should be doing, but we don't share the information and we don't talk about it in a coherent, sensible way. And that's really what I've tried to kind of combat with this book. This is the boil I've tried to lance with my book, if I can just use that rather unpleasant metaphor.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's not punitive. If you get stuck with that image in your head of it's about punishment, then it's hard to get past that and to get into, well, it's about avoiding that. And it's about, yes, sure, part of it is creating parameters and consequences, and there has to be some redirection if it's not going where it needs to go. However, not really the point. The point is,
Well, it's not the point.
it's learning, right? The point is
Sure.
that that's where we need to start. And another thing that you've said, a phrase you've certainly used in relation to the title of the book and otherwise, and that is relevant, and that speaks to the urgency of this is what teachers are faced with, and the more or less, you know, just to use the phrase, the fact that behavior management is a do or die type of thing, that the second you walk into the classroom, you either are going to do it or you're going to have some problems, is that you either run the room or the room is going to run itself, right?
Absolutely.
And that's the reality, is you have to have a strategy. One of the things I think about with that, and thinking about certainly early career teachers, it could be teachers at any stage of their career, but the early career ones that are coming in at different parts on the grade level spectrum. So what's the difference between a 22, 23-year-old first year teacher, and they're teaching first, second grade, 7, 8-year-olds, one who comes in at the secondary level and they're 6 years older than the students they're teaching, or what are the challenges those students are having? There's students who are just starting school and they're just learning the expectations and realities of what school even is. There's others who have been there for a long time and they've maybe learned, maybe they have learned behaviors, but maybe they've learned negative behaviors. Maybe they've had a negative experience. What are some of the things that you look at or would highlight when you're talking to teachers that are at those different parts of the, primary versus secondary or otherwise, that really stand out as the indicators to be looking for?
The indicators to be looking for in terms of what? Indicating what?
Indicating what you need to do. Like, okay, how do I read the room here so that I can run the room, right? Like, let me understand what, right?
Thank you. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It's just my my clumsy Anglo ears here. There's a lot going on in that question.
Right.
But that's fine. So when I talk to teachers, I'll address one of your points first of all and move on to another one. Whether or not you are, 23 years old or 55 years old, or short or tall or big or small, I think a lot of the things that new teachers do to themselves, they can do a lot of damage to themselves by defeating themselves before they've even begun. So I got a lot of teachers saying things, I'm really young, I'm only 6 years older than these kids, or, I'm really short or something like that. They're not going to listen to me. And the weird thing is, I've seen people of any gender, any size, any persuasion, really run a room well, no matter who they are kind of physically, because it's not really about that. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you're over 21, kids think that you listen to the Beatles, and Led Zeppelin. That's it. They've condemned you to, the geriatric stage. And you should embrace that to some extent, because what kids need is an adult. And a lot of people think, I'm not an adult yet. Well, get used to it. It's like the doctor, first time in the hospital, when the nurse says, "Doctor, I need your opinion," and he says, "Who, me?" It's you. Right. So get used to it. And when a teacher takes over a classroom, one of the very first things they need to do is to establish as quickly as possible an understanding between them and the students about what you represent and what you stand for. And what matters to you. So when I meet a new class, I would always get them to come in, first of all. I would get them to stand at the back of the room, not do star jumps or anything, just stand at the back of the room. And then I get them sat down. First of all, I put them in order. I'd decide the seating plan, and I'd always recommend that for a new teacher. Use a seating plan, for God's sake, don't be crazy. And then once you get them sat down, you got to say to them a few things. Now, you can say any way you want, but these are the beats. These are the main plot coupons you need to hit. Number one, you got to say, "Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. This is nice. I'm happy to meet you." You got to say, "My name is Mr. Bennett," or fill in the blank. I teach X. I really look forward to teaching you. I really look forward to teaching you. I love my subject, and I love teaching people your age. And I want you to be the best that you can be. And I know you're all going to do really well in this class, and I believe that you can all do really well. And I promise you I'm going to do my best to make sure that you do really well. I want you to be safe in this class. I want you to be happy in this class. I want you to enjoy the subject as much as possible. And I want you to flourish in this subject. In order for that to happen, though, we're all going to have to behave really well with each other. And this is what we need to do. Boom. And that's it. That's my frame. Then we launch into the specifics of, punctuality and where the pens go and what equipment they need and so on. The point is this, that rather clunky speech tells them several things. One, I matter. Me, the teacher, I really matter in this room. B, you matter too. C, the learning matters. D, we all matter,
Right.
And it's not complicated. But I see it not happen so often. I see teachers just launching and saying, sit down, let's get started. Or I'll see teachers spend 45 minutes gushing over the kids. There needs to be a little bit of give and take. There needs to be, assertive dignity between the two parties. You need to tell the kids that they can do this, because a lot of kids might not believe that. And you also might want to tell the children that they matter and you want them to be safe. Because one of the things we all want in life is to be safe and to matter. And a lot of kids don't feel that at school. And if you've got kids who think, oh, this subject's really hard, or I'm not right for school, or adults just pick on me, or whatever, you need to give them a reason not to think that. Because when you've got 30 pairs of eyes staring at you in a classroom, what you want is to try and realize that there's 30 different views of themselves, of school, of the subject, and so on. And you need to try and unify that really quickly to say, listen, you may not love this subject, but I'll do my best to make sure that you do, and I'll teach you like crazy. I really will teach you well, and you're going to do well here. And I'm going to hold you to a higher standard than maybe you hold yourself. But that's okay. It's because I care about you. And I think one of the nicest things you can say to a kid is, you can really do this. You can do well here. And lots of children don't believe that about themselves already. So that's the type of things you need to do, but you need to do it at the outset. You lay your stall out, you tell them what's expected of them, and you teach it super clearly. And I think something I go back to in my book time and time again is that you can't just tell people what to do. You got to teach them what to do. It's like going back to cars. Why not? If you want to teach someone how to drive, you don't give them a car and the highway code. You teach them how to drive over a period of many weeks, and they practice it, and you watch it, and then you tell them what they should be doing, and then they practice it, and you correct it, and so on. We know quite a bit about how we teach. And Tom Sherrington has written a really good summary book of Rosenshine's Principles, for example, which is a great way of getting into these really basic but utterly sound ways in which we teach things. So we teach behavior, we don't tell it. If you tell someone to behave, who knows if they've understood you or not? I mean, my dad doesn't mind me saying this. My dad was a taxi driver for 30 years.
Right.
And he taught me how to drive. And he was a brilliant driver. But, the world's worst driving instructor.
Right.
He doesn't mind me saying that. Because to him, what was so easy to me was incredibly hard because I had no idea what he meant. We call this the curse of expertise in psychology. When somebody's so good at something, they forget how hard it is for somebody who's not very good at it. And teachers need to be aware of the curse of expertise. And in that regard, then, my dad would get really frustrated with me, and he would say, Tommy, just drive the car, because obviously he's Shrek, right? And
Right.
if just drive it, as if that was something I would understand. But I had no idea what it meant. What it meant to him was just a really simple thing, drive. But what it really is hundreds of little micro behaviors, clutch control and the gear stick and steering wheel and all these things simultaneously. That's driving. Lots of little behaviors made into a big behavior. So when he said drive to me, that's what most kids hear when you say behave. Behave. What does it mean to them? They may have their own views of what that means. And they might not be good at doing the things you ask them to do, like focus or share or be patient and so on. So you've got to teach these things one by one. It's painstaking, but the payoff is enormous. And the consequence of not doing it means you're in hell for the rest of your career.
Yeah, and as you you've used the phrase and really made the point that behavior is a curriculum.
Yeah,
that would be lesson one, right? Clear expectations and mutual accountability. Here's where we are. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I'm going to give you. Here's what I expect you to give me, and go from there. And so that's the foundation. And so there's one other point before we wrap up here, and I guess maybe this is our kind of closing point, but I know it's been a major part of your work, and it really is related to this entire discussion, is specifically addressing the mental health piece. It's the social emotional needs, but when it gets into mental health more explicitly, and their which manifests itself in certain behaviors. And those
Mm-hmm.
behaviors, at this point, may be an indicator of something a student is struggling with, that are, educators aren't necessarily trained mental health professionals. However, they're placed in that position, right, to have
Yeah.
all of these students in their care. I would almost open it up to say, what would you like to say about that topic? But
Yeah.
realistically, just
A
kind of,
lot
I
of
think it's important that we address that directly, because it's part of this conversation, and we shouldn't leave it just where it's implied or inferred. We should note that this is a really an urgent situation facing educators as well.
Sure. Oh,
Yeah.
I've got plenty to say on that matter.
Yeah.
So a couple of things for you there. First of all, a couple of years ago, I chaired, as you mentioned, the Department for Education's mental health panel, which was kind of rebooting the advice we gave to schools when it came to promoting good mental health, which is, as you mentioned, incredibly important. And a couple of things we came up with which I think overlaps with my behavioural work really nicely here, which is that, as you mentioned, very few people in schools are trained clinicians or diagnosticians, and it's incredibly dangerous to pretend you're a therapist or a psychiatrist and so on. We know, for example, that lots of therapeutic interventions can have really serious, dangerous effects with people if they're not done by somebody who's trained to do so. It's like surgery. You wouldn't say, "Oh well, I'll have a crack at that open heart surgery," and yet we often feel in our society we often feel deeply placed to comment on such matters and say, "Oh well, I think they've got clinical depression," and so on. So that's a really, really tough call to make. So that's the first thing I would say in that regard. That you've got to be really careful of the kind of Dunning-Kruger effect, and particularly when you don't know much about something, you think you know more than you do. But secondly, because of this issue that not many people in schools are good at dealing with mental health issues and so on, well, what do we do? What's the best thing we can do? Well, the best thing we can do is something which has been discussed many, many times before. We can create calm, safe spaces where everybody's treated with dignity. And that is of enormous impact to people's well-being, their mental health, and the way they feel about themselves and see other people. And also what it does is it massively reduces the types of triggers which exacerbate mental health situations. So, if you reduce chaos and stress and so on, and you make the environment a bit more structured and much more respectful and dignified, and there's a lot of calm and so on, people feel a lot better in those types of environments, and people don't then have their perhaps prior existing conditions exacerbated. Also, in those types of environments, when you have a calm, safe classroom and calm, safe corridors and safe monitored spaces throughout the school, that's when emergent symptoms of mental health issues can be spotted a lot more easily, because you've got so much less background white noise to deal with. So that's why, I think, as with many things, if you want children to flourish in lots of different ways, one of which being good mental health, great behaviour is one of the best ways in which you can possibly assist with that. And chaotic, unsafe, noisy classrooms are one of the worst things you can possibly do. Secondly, when you've got students in your class who are misbehaving, something which I think most teachers need to hear is this: if you're in a mainstream regular school environment, I'm not talking about like a behavioural school or a special school, or what we would call in the UK alternative provision or pupil referral units, or all kind of special schools for children with who've been moved there for lots of difficulties in their lives and so on. If you're in a mainstream regular school, most misbehaviour is just what we'd say in the UK, we'd just call it mucking around. Yeah, it's messing about. Most misbehaviour. It's done for, I wouldn't say trivial reasons, but it's done for very, very intelligible, very human reasons. They want attention, they're bored of the work, they want their friends to laugh at them, they can't do the work. They're all fairly kind of normal stuff. You may as well ask, why does anyone goof about? And it's not always expressing some kind of deep-seated trauma. I remember I walked into one of my very first classrooms and the kid told me to F off as soon as I walked in, and then he laughed and his friends laughed. And what I didn't go home that night and think to myself was, what was he really trying to tell me?
Right.
What he was really trying to tell me was F off, and I don't give a damn about you. That was my own personal cross to bear. But my point is this: is that a lot of misbehaviour is just goofing off and goofing around, which means that you can normally amend most of that with acres and acres of really positive teaching of great behaviour, You really immerse kids in these norms, these normative messages. You teach them the routines and so on, your expectations, and you support them, and you praise them when they need to be praised and so on. And that's what most children are very amenable to. There is a small percentage of children, of course, who are really, really struggling with trauma in their life and difficulties and mental health issues and cognitive issues and neurological impairments and all kinds of vast array of things that we would call special educational needs in the UK. And we need to be sensitive and alive to that as well. So when you deal with behaviour in a mainstream school, your go-to mechanism should probably be things like teaching behaviours, sanctions, rewards, pastoral conversations, talk to mom, that kind of, the normal stuff that we need to do much more efficiently. At the same time, all teachers and educators need to be alert to the possibility that something deeper is going on, which means that if you see, for instance, behaviour being a pattern, if you see a student's behaviour suddenly getting much worse, or if a student normally misbehaves and they suddenly become very quiet, all these little warning signs, that's when you need to start doing a bit more sleuthing, a bit more Sherlock Holmesing. And that's when, in your pastoral conversations with children, which you should be having anyway, you say to them, right, is anything going on? Is there anything you want to tell me about? Do you want to disclose anything? And you do a little bit of digging around that. And in those situations then, if you think, actually, there is something more going on here that maybe I can't deal with alone, because let's face it, most teachers can't deal with that type of stuff by themselves, nor should they be expected to. That's when the teacher then needs to lean on the school and the wraparound services that the school can access, whether it be mental health provision or social provision and so on. And that's when you trigger these bigger mechanisms within the school. And I often think that sometimes teacher educators are expected to be psychiatrists and therapists and counsellors when they're not trained to be so, which doesn't mean they can't care and have meaningful, caring conversations with them where they express gratitude and sympathy and all kinds of human emotions. But it means when you suspect there's something more going on, you've got to get some help. You've got to remember you're part of a team. And I think that's something else which teachers need to be really aware and alive to.
Right. Yeah, that's spot on advice. This has been Tom Bennett. He's the author of the new book, in addition to many other books, Running the Room, A Teacher's Guide to Behavior. Tom, where can people connect with you to learn more? I know you're on Twitter, you probably website, where would you like to direct people if they want to connect with you?
I'm on Twitter far too much, so you can grab me at Tom Bennett 71 if you want to do that, and you can normally find me at www.tombennettraining.org.uk. But just follow the wool strands that I leave through the labyrinth of Twitter, and you'll come across me eventually. So happy to talk to you.
Tom, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.